the truth about narcissists after no contact. And I want to begin with something that almost nobody in this conversation is saying clearly enough. Something that most content about narcissists and no contact either avoids entirely or addresses in a way that is more satisfying than honest. The truth about what happens to a narcissist after no contact is not a simple story. It is not the story that the most popular version of this conversation tells. The one where no contact devastates the narcissist. Where the silence produces a reckoning that finally makes visible everything the relationship cost. Where somewhere in the absence of your presence the narcissist sits with the full weight of what they did and who they are and what they have lost and experiences something that looks, from the outside, like justice. That version of the story is not entirely wrong. Parts of it are accurate. But it is incomplete in ways that matter. And the incompleteness is not innocent. It serves a purpose that is understandable, but not ultimately useful to someone who is trying to navigate the aftermath of a narcissistic relationship with the kind of clear-eyed honesty that genuine healing requires. The purpose is comfort. The story of the narcissist suffering in the silence you created is comforting. It provides a sense of proportionality, that the damage was recognized, that the loss registered, that somewhere on the other side of the silence the person who cost you so much is experiencing something of what they caused. And I am not here to take that comfort away from you, because some version of it is warranted. But I am here to give you something more useful than comfort. I am here to give you the complete picture. What actually happens to a narcissist after no contact. The parts that feel like justice, the parts that don't, and the parts that are more complicated than either, is what this episode is going to cover fully, honestly, and without the simplifications that make the story easier, but leave you less equipped to understand what you are actually dealing with. So stay with me. The complete picture is more interesting than the simplified one, and it is considerably more useful. Let's start with what no contact actually represents in the narcissist psychological landscape, because this is the foundation everything else rests on, and because most people who implement no contact have a clear sense of what it means for them. The boundary, the protection, the decision to remove themselves from a dynamic that was costing more than it was giving, without an equally clear sense of what it means for the narcissist. And what it means for the narcissist is something that requires understanding the specific function you were serving in the narcissist psychological economy before you left, because the significance of your absence is directly proportional to the significance of your presence, and the significance of your presence was not what the narcissist's behavior during the relationship suggested it was. During the relationship, the narcissist's behavior communicated, repeatedly and in a variety of ways both explicit and implicit, that you were replaceable, that your value was conditional, that there was always someone else available who would not ask so much or expect so much or see so clearly or resist so consistently the aspects of the dynamic that were most damaging to you. This communication was not accidental. It was functional, designed to maintain the power differential in the relationship by keeping you uncertain about your own value within it, which kept you working harder to secure a belonging that the narcissist could withdraw at any moment. But the communication was also, in one very specific and very important dimension, false. You were not as replaceable as the behavior suggested. And the no-contact period is where that falseness becomes visible, to you, and in ways that are considerably less comfortable than the replacement communication suggested, to the narcissist as well. Here is what you were actually providing that is not immediately replaceable. Not the obvious supply, the admiration, the attention, the emotional investment that the love bombing was designed to generate, and that the relationship was organized around extracting. That supply is relatively fungible. The narcissist's ability to generate that kind of supply from new sources is typically intact after no contact, and is often accelerated by it, because the supply-seeking drive that you were providing some portion of now has to be met entirely from external sources, which produces the increased social visibility and the conspicuous new relationship that you have probably already observed if you have been watching from any distance. That movement toward new supply, toward visible forward momentum, toward the performance of moving on, is real and it is relatively efficient, and it is not the part of your absence that is producing what this episode is actually about. What is producing what this episode is actually about is the specific, non-fungible thing you provided that the new supply cannot replicate. And that thing is different for different people, depending on the specific nature of the relationship and the specific qualities you brought to it. But there are several categories of it that appear with enough consistency across enough narcissistic relationships that they are worth naming specifically, because naming them is what allows you to understand why the narcissist's experience of no contact is more complex than either the suffering narrative or the complete indifference narrative accounts for. The first non-fungible thing is your specific knowledge of them, not knowledge in the general sense that any intimate partner accumulates over the course of a significant relationship. The practical knowledge of preferences and habits and history that any sufficiently attentive person develops. The specific knowledge that comes from the particular quality of perception you brought to the relationship. If you are an empath, if you are someone who reads people at depth, if you are someone whose sensitivity was one of the things the narcissist was drawn to, and one of the things they eventually found most threatening, then the knowledge you developed about this specific narcissist is not knowledge they are comfortable with someone else possessing. It is knowledge of the gap between the presented self and the actual self, knowledge of the specific mechanisms, the specific deflections, the specific vulnerabilities underneath the construction, the specific moments when the actual self was briefly visible before the construction reasserted itself. You know things about this person that they have not shown anyone else, in many cases things they have barely shown themselves. And the no contact means you are out there, somewhere, in possession of that knowledge, and they have no access to how you are using it, what you are saying with it, what understanding you are arriving at with it, in the absence of the relationship's active management of your perception. This is a specific and significant source of unease in the narcissist during no contact that does not get adequately named in most conversations about this dynamic. It is not guilt about what was done to you. It is the discomfort of someone who knows they were seen more clearly than is comfortable, and who has lost the ability to monitor and manage what the seeing is producing in the person who did the seeing. The second non-fungible thing is the regulatory function your specific responsiveness was providing. This is more subtle than the first and more difficult to articulate clearly, but it is arguably more consequential for understanding the narcissist's experience of no contact. Every significant relationship provides the people inside it with a degree of emotional regulation, a calibration of the internal state through the ongoing responsiveness of another person whose reactions and engagement confirm the reality of your own experience. This is not unique to narcissistic relationships. It is a feature of all close human bonds. But in the narcissistic relationship, it takes a specific form that is more intensive and more dependency producing than in healthy relationships, because the narcissist's internal state is considerably more unstable than the constructed external presentation suggests, and the supply that the relationship provides is not simply pleasant. It is regulatory in a way that is closer to necessary than to preferred. Your specific responsiveness, the way you reacted to the narcissist, the way your emotional engagement confirmed the particular version of themselves they were presenting to you, the way your presence calibrated their sense of their own reality, was providing regulation that has a specific flavor, a specific quality, a specific frequency that is yours and is therefore not perfectly replicable by someone else's responsiveness to the same presented self. The new supply provides regulation, but it provides it at a slightly different frequency. And the difference, imperceptible to the narcissist in conscious terms, is perceptible in the background of their experience as a low-grade wrongness that the new supply's enthusiasm and availability cannot entirely correct. You are gone, and the specific quality of regulation your responsiveness provided is gone with you. And in the no-contact period, in the quietest moments when the new supply is not actively engaged and the narcissist's internal state is operating without the regulatory input it was organized around receiving, something is missing that has no immediate replacement. And the missing of it is not grief in the way most people experience grief. It is more like a frequency dropout, a background static where a signal used to be, imperceptible when everything else is loud enough, impossible to ignore in the silence. The third non-fungible thing is the one that is most rarely discussed and most significant for understanding what the narcissist's experience of no contact actually produces at the deepest level of their psychology. It is the loss of the witness. Every human being needs to be witnessed, to have their experience acknowledged as real by someone whose acknowledgement carries weight. For the narcissist, the need for witnessing is more acute than for most people because the construction of the false self was built in response to a foundational experience of the actual self being insufficient or unsafe to present, which means the actual self has been inadequately witnessed for essentially the entire duration of the narcissist's adult life. The supply that the narcissist extracts from relationships is, at its deepest level, an attempt to get the false self witnessed in ways that the actual self never was, to get the constructed version of themselves confirmed as real and significant and worthy of the acknowledgement that the actual self was denied, and you, in the specific way that you were present in the relationship, provided witnessing that was of a different quality than what most supply sources provide, because you saw more than the construction, because your perception reached past the presented self toward something underneath it, even when you could not fully name what you were perceiving. And the witnessing that comes from someone who sees more than the surface is categorically different from the witnessing that comes from someone who is only responding to the surface. It carries a weight that surface-level witnessing does not carry, and it is gone. And what the narcissist experiences in the no-contact period, in the specific gap left by its absence, is something they do not have adequate language for and cannot consciously identify as what it actually is. The most significant loss available to a psychology that has been inadequately witnessed for its entire existence, losing the one witness who saw past the construction. And what that loss does to the narcissist's behavior in the weeks and months of no contact, and why the patterns it produces are so specifically recognizable once you know what you are looking for, and what the narcissist eventually does when the loss becomes undeniable. That is exactly where we are going next. What the loss does to the narcissist's behavior in the weeks and months of no contact is not a single, consistent, easily trackable sequence. And I want to resist the temptation to present it as one, because the temptation is strong and the resistance is important. Most content about narcissists and no contact presents the aftermath as a predictable progression. Denial, then panic, then hoovering, then moving on, each stage arriving on a roughly predictable schedule and producing roughly predictable behaviors that the person who implemented no contact can monitor from a safe distance to confirm that the silence is having the intended effect. This is not entirely wrong as a general orientation. Those phases do exist and do appear with enough consistency to be worth naming. But the version of them that actually unfolds is considerably messier and more variable and more dependent on the specific narcissist, the specific relationship, and the specific nature of what was lost than the tidy sequence suggests. So what I want to give you is not a timeline but a map of the territory, the specific psychological experiences that the no-contact period produces in the narcissist, in whatever order and at whatever pace they arrive for this specific person in this specific aftermath, and what those experiences produce in terms of behavior that the person who implemented no contact may encounter directly or hear about indirectly, or simply need to understand, is happening even in the absence of invisible evidence that it is. The first territory is the one that arrives earliest, and that is most consistently misread by the people observing it from outside. The narcissist appears fine. More than fine, in many cases they appear to be thriving, with a visibility and a social momentum, and a conspicuous engagement with new people and new experiences that reads, to anyone watching, as a confirmation of everything the relationship's narrative suggested about your replaceability. The new relationship appears. The social media activity increases. The public-facing version of the narcissist's life looks, if anything, more vibrant than it looked during the relationship. And this is where the suffering narrative collides with reality in a way that is genuinely painful for the people who implemented no contact, and were hoping for evidence that the silence was registering as more than inconvenience. It does not look like suffering. It looks like freedom. And the question that most people are sitting with in this phase: did any of it matter? Did I matter? Was any of what I thought I saw in this person real? Is a question that the narcissist's visible behavior in this phase is specifically designed, consciously or not, to answer in the most painful possible way. No, you did not matter. Look how easily replaced you were. Look how little the absence of you disrupted the forward momentum of someone who was never as invested as you were. But here is what is actually happening underneath the visibility of this phase, and why the appearance of thriving is not the same as the experience of thriving, and why the distinction matters more than almost anything else in understanding what the no-contact period is actually producing. The narcissist in this phase is not experiencing freedom. They are experiencing the urgency of supply, seeking at an intensity that the relationship, whatever its cost to you, was partially managing. The new relationship, the increased social visibility, the conspicuous forward momentum, these are not the expressions of someone who has been liberated by your departure. They are the expressions of someone whose regulatory system is running at a higher demand than usual, and is responding to that demand by seeking supply with an increased frequency and an increased urgency that the forward momentum is both producing and concealing. The thriving is real in the sense that supply seeking is genuinely energizing for a narcissist whose system is organized around it. But it is not thriving in the sense of an internal state that is stable, that would persist in the absence of the supply seeking, that represents a genuine equilibrium rather than a managed acceleration. Underneath the acceleration in the moments between supply sources in the private experience of someone who has lost the specific regulatory input that your presence was providing is the frequency dropout we discussed, the background static where the signal used to be, most audible in the quiet that the acceleration is specifically designed to prevent. The second territory arrives when the acceleration is not enough to cover the quiet. And when it arrives depends entirely on the depth of the relationship, the degree to which the non-fungible things you provided were integrated into the narcissist's psychological functioning, and the specific vulnerability of this particular narcissist's actual self to the loss of the specific witness that you were. For some narcissists, this territory arrives within weeks. For others, it takes months or longer, or arrives in fragments rather than as a recognizable phase. But it arrives in the form of what most people would describe, if they could observe it directly, as a restlessness that the supply-seeking cannot fully address. A quality of dissatisfaction that runs underneath every new experience, every new relationship, every interaction that should be providing the regulatory hit and is providing it, but at a slightly wrong frequency. The narcissist starts reaching, not necessarily toward you directly, not initially. The reaching toward you comes later in the sequence, if it comes at all, and its coming is not reliable and its meaning is not what it appears to be when it arrives. The reaching in this phase is more general, a reconnection with people from the past who were previously discarded, a sudden interest in mutual connections that might provide information about you without the narcissist having to reach toward you directly, a social media behavior change that positions your mutual network to carry information in both directions without the narcissist having to explicitly request the information or acknowledge that they are seeking it. This behavior is not dignified, and it is not comfortable to observe if you become aware of it. But it is information. It is the narcissist system doing what it always does when the current supply is insufficient, reaching for what is not currently available, for what was providing something that the current arrangement is failing to provide. And what it is reaching for, underneath all of the indirect maneuvering, is the specific thing you provided that the new supply cannot replicate, the frequency of your witnessing, the specific regulatory quality of your responsiveness, the non-fungible things. The third territory is the one that most directly intersects with your life, which is why it requires the most careful understanding. This is the territory of the reaching toward you specifically, the hoovering that the content about narcissists and no contact consistently describes, the attempts at reestablishing contact that the no contact is specifically designed to prevent, the message that arrives or the call that comes, or the appearance in a space where appearing is a form of communication without the vulnerability of direct contact. This reaching is real, and it is common enough to be nearly universal in narcissistic relationships where the no contact follows a significant dynamic, a relationship in which the non-fungible things were genuinely present, in which your witnessing was of the quality that reached past the construction, in which the regulatory function of your responsiveness was integrated deeply enough into the narcissist's psychological functioning that its removal produces the kind of gap that the new supply cannot fill. The reaching is real, and it requires the most careful and the most honest possible assessment of what it actually is, because the assessment of what it is will determine how you respond to it, and how you respond to it will determine whether the no contact holds or whether the boundary that cost you so much to establish dissolves in the specific way that the reaching was designed to dissolve it. What the reaching actually is, in most cases, is not what it presents itself as. It presents itself as recognition, as the narcissist having arrived through the experience of your absence, at an understanding of what the relationship actually was, and what your presence actually meant, and what they are responsible for having done to something that was worth more than the way they treated it. This presentation is convincing in the specific way that the narcissist's presentations have always been convincing, because it contains enough genuine material to feel real. The missing is genuine. The gap is genuine. The reaching is motivated by something that is, at its most basic level, a real experience of loss. All of that is true. And the reaching is still not recognition in the sense that genuine change would require it to be, because recognition as change requires the narcissist to have done something that the reaching itself is evidence they have not done. The sustained, honest, uncomfortable work of understanding not just that the loss is significant but why it occurred, what in their psychology produced the behaviors that made the relationship what it was, and what would need to be genuinely different about those behaviors for a relationship with you to produce different outcomes. The reaching is the narcissist system seeking restoration of what was lost without the reckoning that produced the loss. It is the desire for the outcome without the process that would make a different outcome possible, and the distinction between those two things, between reaching for restoration and having done the work that genuine change requires, is the most important distinction available to you in the entire no-contact period. Because responding to the reaching without that distinction intact is not giving the relationship a second chance. It is giving the same dynamic a second run with a slightly different emotional context and the same fundamental architecture. And the same fundamental architecture will produce the same fundamental outcomes. The timeline may differ. The specific expressions may differ. The outcome will not. So what do you do with all of this? What does the complete picture of what happens to a narcissist after no contact actually mean for how you hold the silence you have created and what you do with it? It means the silence is working even when it does not look like it is working. The acceleration is the silence working. The indirect reaching through mutual connections is the silence working. The eventual direct reaching is the silence working. All of it is evidence that the non-fungible things you provided are not being successfully replaced, and that the narcissist system is responding to their absence in the only ways available to it. None of it means you should end the silence. None of it is evidence of the change that would be required for ending the silence to produce something different than what the relationship produced before. It is evidence of the loss being real. And the loss being real is not the same as the narcissist being ready for you. It may never produce readiness in the sense that genuine change would require. And your silence does not need to wait for that readiness to be justified. Your silence is not a strategy designed to produce a specific outcome in the narcissist. At its deepest and most honest level, your silence is not about the narcissist at all. It is about you, about the specific, non-negotiable requirement that the life you are building in the no-contact period belongs entirely to you. Not organized around what the narcissist is experiencing. Not shaped by monitoring the effects of your absence. Not structured by the hope of the reaching producing something that the relationship in its existing form was never going to produce. The truth about narcissists after no contact is that they experience the absence, genuinely, in ways that are more complex and more significant than the replacement narrative suggests and less transformative than the suffering narrative hopes. They experience the absence. And what you do with that knowledge, whether you let it pull you back towards someone who has not done the work that would make going back anything other than a return to what was, or whether you let it confirm that what you provided was real and significant and worth protecting in the new life you are building. That choice is the only part of this entire story that actually belongs to you. And it is the most important part. It always was.